to start, what we would like to do is we'd like to read an acknowledgement of the land of the University of Illinois, because the Morrow plots is a long, ongoing experiment started in 1876 that's been going on since that time. It's the second oldest ongoing agricultural experiment in the world, second only to the Rothamsted Field here in the UK. But we would like to definitely acknowledge the context of that land. So if I might read this official statement from the University of Illinois. As a land grant institution, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. In order to remind ourselves and our community, we will begin this presentation with the following statement. The University of Illinois sits on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscatoon, Odawu, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations, and it's necessary for us to acknowledge these native peoples, and we continue to do so as we work to move forward as an institution over the next 150 years. We hope to be a vibrant community inclusive of all of our differences with native peoples at the core. So that being said, the Morrow plots is sort of a centerpiece, a piece of pride for the College of Agriculture. And in 2018, I went to our Associate Dean of Research and said, I've got an idea. I'd like to find a way to get researchers more involved at the front end of curating their data, so that on the back end of it, they'll have data sets that are more useful for scholarly output, so that people will want to engage with their work a bit more, and they'll have something that they can show and will be cited. Thinking I could do some instruction and maybe some teaching about the tools that we have at the University of Illinois. The response that I got was, the 150th anniversary of the Morrow plots is coming up. I thought this was a professorial non sequitur. I thought, what? Okay, great, professor. Well, what do you have to say? But it became clear soon what he meant. He said, what if you took the historical data of the Morrow plots, these old cornfields that were put up to show the effect of crop rotation? What if you curated those data and made them available so that researchers could see that even with really old data, you could come out with something on the other side that was useful, that was well described, well preserved, and then openly available for the world. Okay, I got it now. And he said, at that 150th anniversary, it would be great if we had this done so that we could have a symposium and we could invite the world to look at our data, to look at our plots, to kind of celebrate this with us. And so the Morrow Plots Data Curation Group was born. And it became very clear to me that I could not do that on my own. So that's why Sandi and Bethany and all the folks that are up here on this list came in. So a little bit more about the plots. So the plots, as I said, were established in 1876. And initially, they were 10 one-acre plots. It was established by a guy named Manly Miles, who was said to be the first modern, arguably, first modern professor of agriculture. And in 1877, George E. Morrow came, and he joined the University of Illinois as our Dean of Agriculture. And you may think, okay, why is he telling this? Because the next year, Manly Miles, the man who started the experiment, left. And we had our first change of champions. The person who was the champion for the data was gone, and now we had someone new. And this happened many, many times over the course of the plots. Many handoffs. In 1895, they chopped the plots down in order to make room for an observatory. And then later on in 1903, the only thing that was left was plots 3, 4, and 5, because they decided they need to put a library up and an administrative building. So now we've got 3 enduring plots that have been subdivided in order to continue the experiment. And it's nearly 150 years. There have been many changes of people who were responsible for the plots, many changes of people who were recording the data, and a lot of challenges came out of that when you think about curating it and preserving it. So I'll pass that on to Bethany.
Great. Thank you, Josh. So as Josh just alluded to, there were many different people who were involved in the Morrow plots over time, and that has led to many different sources for the data. So as Josh mentioned, the Morrow Plots Data Curation Working Group is seeking to highlight the plot's history and also make the plot's data broadly available, but also ensure that the data are preserved. However, in order to make the data available, it was really important for us to first locate and identify the data recorded from the plots and transform that data into a machine-readable format. And so the University of Illinois Archives, where I work, has a number of records that document the history of the Morrow plots, including photographs and administrative records, as well as various reports that were produced by what was then called the Agriculture Experiment Station, which chronicled the management of the plots over time, but it did it rather inconsistently, and so it wasn't really a source that we could rely upon. But luckily for us, in 2019, the Crop Sciences Department at the University of Illinois transferred a notebook to the archives, which fills a critical gap in the materials that we have for documenting the history of the experiment and fostering a greater scientific understanding of the plots. The notebook, which has been digitized, importantly contains data starting in 1876, which was when the plots were established, and it goes through 1913. And so from 1876 through 1887, it includes data for corn, oats, and clover that were planted at the plots, as well as information about crop rotation and fertilizers that were introduced as well. Before we had acquired this notebook, the earliest data we had were for 1888, and it spanned pretty much to the present, to 2021. And those came from ledgers that were partially compiled by scholars who previously published on the plots. So in addition to identifying, compiling, and making this data machine readable, one of the main challenges we have encountered are inconsistencies in the data that were recorded. So to take this notebook as an example, unfortunately, data yields from the plots were not recorded between 1876 and 1887. And so the only data we can glean from that period of time were which particular crops were planted in specific plots. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sandi next, who's going to discuss the process for trying to wrangle all of this disparate data and try to discern what kind of record-keeping practices were in place. So over to Sandi.
Yeah, so as a data curator, this is the fun part for me. So as you can see from this kind of simplified workflow we have here, we compiled our longitudinal data set primarily from the three sources that Bethany introduced that are kind of in chronological order here as well, starting with the notebook at the top, from which we manually were able to pull some data to complement the more fulsome data set in the middle there, which are yield tables that cover years 1888 to 1954. So we received these in an Excel format, but they were quite not machine readable, so it took a lot of cleaning. And then we also have an Excel tracker, which was maintained by various farm managers over the years and has lots of kind of human readable foibles in it, like lots of color coding and notes in places where notes shouldn't be that make it kind of like a fun challenge to then clean and compile. So I won't go into detail on that process, but we minimally started with Excel to get these various sources into a CSV format that we could push into our studio, and then use that as our primary tool for cleaning and compiling and tidying these data. And so when I boil it down into a diagram, that sounds kind of straightforward and simple, but of course there were loads of bumps along the way. And so some of the issues that we ran into were things like having notes and texts and fields where it had no business being, but these were important information we needed to still preserve. One of the biggest problems we had was competing units of measurement. So we had yield figures where we had a mix of yields that were measured in bushels and yields that were measured in tons in the same column. So I don't have an agriculture background, but I know that those aren't comparable. So these were some of the fun kind of data issues that I got to work with and dig into. But the biggest one of all was just the changes that were made to the experiment over a century, and how that shifted the format of the data. And so we had to find a way to kind of create a longitudinal data set that would allow us to make historical comparisons across the whole history of the experiment, which meant that we really had to understand the context of the experiment, which I'll let Bethany speak to a bit more.
Okay. So as with understanding any scientific data, context matters, and this is, especially true for the Morrow plots data. So the data wrangling that Sandi just described requires a firm grasp on the experiment design and its history. And so we can look to things like different publications and archival records to kind of glean that context, but it takes a lot of work to translate that narrative text into a mental map, and even more to keep track of how that map changes at key points in time. And so visualizations and visual aids are much better suited to communicating spatial concepts like plot divisions, and current design tools make it easy to layer in all kinds of symbols that communicate much more quickly and easily than words. So to aid our understanding of the history of the experiment, Sandi created this wonderful infographic that is on the slide there to help aid our own understanding of the history of the experiment. She used Canva to help create that graphic. And so this visualization helps us essentially kind of understand the plot divisions and how and when they changed, the crops that were grown, the rotation schedule, and key phases in the experiment over time. And we share a link to a document on the very last slide that includes a number of references that relate to our project, and we'll also include a link to this infographic if you'd like to take a closer look at it, because it might be a little difficult to see some of the details that are there on the slide. So I want to talk briefly about one part of this infographic, which presents what ended up being the 3 enduring plots that Josh mentioned at the very beginning. So as Josh had noted, over time, the original Morrow plots were subdivided again and again as new variables were introduced. Each original plot eventually became 8 subplots. And the 3 remaining plots that were subdivided were initially numbered plots 3, 4, and 5. And so visualizations such as this draft infographic enable us to visually and quickly understand these complexities and subdivisions over time as these new variables were being introduced and the plots were also themselves changing. And so such visualizations are useful for understanding the complexities of this data set. So while we've made a lot of progress in identifying the data, curating the data, and enriching the connected context around this data, there is still a lot of work that we have yet to do as a team. Visualizations like this infographic help to make both the richness and complexity of the data set more accessible and engaging for a broader audience. And the tidy data format, which Sandi used for curating this data, produces preservation-friendly CSV files that distill the complexity of the data for broader accessibility. But as a work in progress, we hope to continue identifying more archival materials that can shed greater light on the history of the plots, fully curate the available data, preserve the data in our digital preservation repository, and engage with the researchers and staff who through the years have worked with the Morrow plots in some way to get their feedback on the data set. And this is especially really important because we want to make sure that we get feedback from the various user communities that will be using this data, but also from the folks who will potentially be adding to this data set over time. So it's really important to have a dialogue with them around this data. And finally, as we noted, in 2026, we will be hosting an interdisciplinary celebration and symposium on the Morrow plots. But in the meantime, if you're interested, you can scan this QR code on our slide if you'd like to access various links to resources that are related to our project, which include the digitized Morrow plots notebook, a public Zotero library that we've compiled, and the infographic that we mentioned. So thank you so much, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
So if I can just quickly say, if you can join us at the next iPres, it will be in Urbana-Champaign, where the plots are.
That's right.
I'm looking forward to visiting them, yeah. My excuse. This microphone? Whilst the microphone's coming down, quick question from me. Well, go for it.
Thank you for a really engaging presentation, and I loved seeing critters and crop circles referenced. That was great.
It's fun history.
So my question is, in preparation for the 150th celebration, do you have a ready-made group of users for the data, or is that something you're having to actually create, to bring the archive to life? And if so, how are you doing that?
That's a very interesting question, and Sandi, I think there's part of it that you may want to answer, but I know for a fact that over the last 4 or 5 years, we've gotten several requests for the data. Can I have the data from the Morrow plots? Would love to see it. shucks. We're working on it, sort of a thing. So there is an audience that is asking for it. That's not necessarily the audience that we were thinking as we were putting this together, although we would love for them to use it and to have it. I think, Sandi, you kind of have talked before about your passion of teaching with real data, and this is something that we kind of envision could hopefully happen with the Morrow plots data.
Yeah, so one audience that we are hoping to seek out and attract are people who are learning about data management and data processing. And I, as someone who's done a lot of workshops on these topics, I really see the value in using real data for these purposes, although it can be difficult for instructors to find data sets that are kind of like easily digestible and understandable by people without subject matter expertise. But with historical data like this, it's not, extremely complicated, big, like physics data. Most folks can wrap their heads around things like planting corn and then measuring how much corn you get. So I'm hoping to create some learning objects and educational tools that people can put this data to a new use outside of necessarily just the research context.
Do you have any questions online before I steam into mine? I've got a couple of questions for me. What was your biggest challenge in this project? And related to that, your biggest learning for future projects of a similar ilk?
Well, I think I can start by saying I think we've all learned the value of having a large group with varying expertise being a part of this and having time and institutional support to dedicate to this, because this I did a lot of the data manipulation on my own, but I wouldn't have been able to do any of that without the support and expertise of my colleagues. So, does anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, and I'll say that I think this group has been really helpful because it's made me think a lot about like the historical data that we have in the archives, and like Sandi was saying, the importance of having a group to talk through like how are we going to curate this data, how are we going to make it available, and so I think that it's really important to have lots of folks at the table for projects like this.
I think the thing that I've learned the most, and it relates to a slide that I saw earlier in this conference, I think, where there was an iceberg with a small tip and a very large, that kind of what we've talked to you about here is really the tip of the iceberg of what is out there. We've started talking to people who have worked with these data over the years in one facet or another. Maybe they're soil scientists, maybe they're agronomists. We've actually got some engineers that have used it to train machine learning models and things like that. So there's a lot of uses that have been done out there that we're just beginning to discover. And the hope is that if we can build something central that people can coalesce around, then we can have an opportunity to collect more of those stories and to understand what kind of impact this kind of, what some folks thought is just kind of a souvenir plot in the middle of our campus is, the sort of impact that it's had over the years.
I'll just quickly add, anyone who wants to talk about problems with data cleaning, please find me. I love to talk about it.
There were a lot.
I think that might have been my poster you were referencing there.
It was.
It was. Question on the back there.
Yeah, I have a question about like continual maintenance of the data set as it grows. It's interesting because you have this like sort of cross-functional collaboration of different data inputs from the archives and other functional parts of the library that manage data. So how do you imagine those sort of loops or connections being maintained as data comes into the IR or into the archive through accession and so forth?
Yeah, so part of what that's going to take is relationship building and relationship maintenance. So we think that we've cleaned and compiled the data into a format that will make it relatively easy to connect to other data sets or to update with new data. And the R code that we've used to do that is something that is repeatable and adaptable, so we can kind of go back and add more to that. But in order to make that really successful, we have to have relationships with those people who are producing new data. So part of what we're doing now is building more of an active working relationship with the soil lab, which is monitoring the farms and collecting new data so that we can continue to work with them and hopefully to make continual updates and new versions as we continue to operate the plots.
Do we have any further questions online? Any further questions in the room? Well, thank you so much, and please show your appreciation.